Hello everyone, this is POW Ponder on Weather. In this update, we're going to be talking about my winter forecast for 2021-2022. So if you do like weather-related content, please subscribe to my channel as I will upload daily updates to keep you ahead of the storm. So let's get right to it. First of all, I wanted to go over some of the reasonings behind my winter forecast. So before we delve into it, let's take a look at some of the reasonings behind it. First of all, I think we're actually going into a weak La Nina. If we're not there already, we've been predominantly in an Enzo neutral. And if you recall last year, we were in one of those weak La Nina type patterns. And for the Climate Prediction Center actually has us upwards to a 70, if not almost 80% chance now, probability of us being in a weak La Nina heading into the peak of the winter months, going into December, January, as well as February here, depicted on the blue line. Another reason is I do feel we are still in a low solar cycle. This is where we're currently in right now. 2020, last year, we saw those polar outbreaks coming out, especially in February with that huge, massive Arctic outbreak coming through. A lot of that was indicative of us being into a low solar, and we are still typically going to be in a low solar all the way through the rest of winter. Here we are currently right now, and in fact, it's not even actually expected to peak out until 2025 when we get into a solar maximum. And if that actually happens, that would be the shortest, what they call solar cycle, since 1755. So that is definitely interesting. But one of the reasons behind the low solar is you get what they call high latitude blocking. So one of the things that you get from like polar vortexes to be able to make it into the United States is they get some sort of like Greenland block, Alaskan block. You got to have some sort of blocking that takes place to have that colder air displaced from the Arctic. And when you are in a low solar type environment, more of a weak La Nina type environment, those are more typically more favored to see some of those displacements from the Arctic, pouring that cold Arctic polar air into the United States. And I do feel that is going to happen this winter. So let's move forward. Another reason, yeah, let's take a look at the latest CANship models. And this is September when I'm doing this video. This already is implying in November. There are already definitely signs out there. We could be on the early stages of an early winter this year. So here's the latest forecast from the CANship models going into November. We are starting to see some of those signs of that high latitude blocking happening and allowing that cold funnel polar air into the United States. All this would be implying this would be actually below average temperatures in November for much of the northern and central and southern regions of the US. So we're already seeing signs of some of that high latitude blocking. In fact, the latest CFS outlook that just came out on September the 10th has that high latitude blocking, that some of that polar displacement. It has that kind of a spike in the Arctic where it displaces some of that polar air into the southern regions of the United States. So we're definitely seeing more and more signs as we move forward going into fall, and especially as going into the winter months, that we're definitely starting to see, if not an early taste of winter this year. Now, what would that look like as far as temperatures? Here's the latest outlook from the CFS model. This is actually November. So, right, so this would be your November forecast. It has that displacement. So whenever you get a displacement, you have a spike in the Arctic. So basically the Arctic actually turns warmer, and then all that colder air in the Arctic gets displaced down here in the United States. And that's indicative of this high latitude blocking that would take shape. And yeah, we could be seeing an early taste of winter here going in November with some of those below average anomalies for a good chunk of the US, from basically the northern US all the way through, all the way down to the deep south into Texas, and much of the southeast could actually be below average. So we're definitely already seeing signs. In fact, if we continue into December, now this actually came out about 2 months ago, but we're seeing multi-months confirmation of a what they call a stratospheric warming event of another displacement. You recall we actually had one of those last year. We had one of those in 2019. All that basically means again is that, again, more of that cold Arctic air would funnel into the United States and going all the way down into the US and reaching all the way down into the deep south. That is the latest UK Met model. And the European is implying the same thing. So we're definitely already seeing multiple models actually coming together, not just on 1 month, but the 2 months in a row now. It's implying that, hey, we could be looking at an early taste of winter this year, maybe starting as early as November, but especially as we go into December, which would be the first of the winter months. So now let's get into the actual winter forecast. So as we go into winter, this is basically implying this is from December the 1st through the end of February. So that would be called meteorologically winter. So as far as the precipitation forecast, I'm looking for well above average precipitation to come back for the Pacific Northwest for much of Washington and Oregon and Northern California in this green shaded area. Some of that would filter into portions of Idaho and to Montana as well. Unfortunately, with the La Nina coming back, you never really got out of those dry conditions in California. And unfortunately, those drier conditions are going to continue for much of California with well below average precipitation for those regions. The monsoon dies off, so you would start getting below average precipitation into Arizona, getting into New Mexico. That would filter into Utah and even into portions of Wyoming. I do feel is going to be well below average precipitation. Now, as we get into parts of Texas, it's still going to be below average. I do feel the southern jet streams tends to more or less get shut off or not nearly as active. So you don't see those heavier, higher precipitation anomaly rains. In a La Nina type environment, you would actually see below average precipitation for the southern regions. Now, that's not implying you can't get snow. Okay, I got some snow in your forecast, but I do feel over those 90 days that you're going to be below average as far as precipitation goes for much of the deep south here into the brown shaded areas, for much of Kansas, going into Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas, much of the deep south into Florida, all the way into Georgia, parts of the Carolinas as well. In this blue shaded area, that's where I feel like it's going to be predominantly just about average precipitation for much of the Dakotas, getting into parts of Kansas here as well, and parts of Iowa. Overall, I do feel over those 90 days, it's going to be more or less average precipitation. But as we go into parts of the Great Lakes and going into the Ohio Valley, as well as into this green shaded area, that's where I feel like it's going to come back to well above average precipitation for those regions, for much of the Great Lakes, much of the Ohio Valley, into the mid-Atlantic states, and even getting into along the I-95 corridor here, going into parts of the Carolinas as well. But as you get into more or less into the New England states, I do feel it's going to turn to kind of a more average precipitation over those 90 days for much of Vermont, New Hampshire, getting into Maine as we go into the extreme portions of the northeastern seaboard. So now let's take a look at the overall temperature forecast. So let's start off in the west again. So I do feel we're going to see below average temperatures for much of the Pacific Northwest into Washington and Oregon, getting into Idaho again. But again, where it's going to be dry, you're going to be warmer than average for much of California, much of Utah, getting into Arizona here. I do feel we're going to be seeing a transition zone. I think you're still going to get some polar activity, but over time, I do feel if you average out the entire winter, I do feel this zone right here in the green zone is going to be more or less average temperatures for those winter months and much of Montana here, much of, getting into portions of, say, Albuquerque area, all this area in the green shaded area, I do feel you're going to be more or less average temperatures for those winter months. But now let's take a look at this dark shaded blue area. That's where I feel like you're going to be getting the heart of winter, more of those polar vortexes, more of those Arctic outbreaks, those Arctic plunge in temperatures where it's going to be definitely frigid at times. You're going to be seeing the coldest air, or say more or less the worst of winter in these regions for much of the Dakotas, getting into Montana, with parts of the all the Great Lakes into Wisconsin and into Michigan. As we get into, say, Cleveland, upstate New York, those are the areas are probably going to be seeing the most frigid air of the season. But it's still going to be cold. Even if you go further south to that, I still feel well below average temperatures are coming up for winter, and much of Iowa, getting in here to parts of Kansas as well, getting into St. Louis, all these areas into Indiana and Ohio, getting into parts of more or less the mid-Atlantic states along the I-95 corridor. All of these areas are going to be well below average for predominantly the winter months. But yes, as we go into a little bit further to the north, as we get into, say, Vermont and New Hampshire, further up north into, especially as into Maine, I do feel we're going to be a transition to more or less average temperatures. Well, now let's go to the deep south. So I think a lot of this colder air is going to make it down to the deep south again. So much of Oklahoma, into Arkansas, into Kentucky, getting into Tennessee, more or less into the Carolina states, all really into Florida as well. I do feel some of those polar air and some of those colder air at times is going to bleed into Florida. So averaging out, I do feel you're going to be predominantly below average for much of Texas, even into Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. I feel it's going to be a colder winter, more or less on tap for much of the northern and central and southern thirds of the United States. So now let's get into the snowfall forecast. So now let's talk to snow. Now let's get into the Pacific Northwest, where I do feel not only is going to be well above average precipitation, but I do feel you're going to be above average as far as the snow goes as well. And much of Washington and Oregon, getting into Idaho, Montana, Wyoming here. Then I think it's going to be transferring into below average snowfall, where it's going to be drier as we get into parts of California, going into Utah, into Nevada, going into Arizona as well, bleeding into New Mexico, and there's going to be parts of West Texas I do feel is going to be below average, all the way down to the Rio Grande Valley and the deep south of Texas below average, and much of central and southern Florida below average as far as snowfall goes as well. I don't think the snow is actually going to make it that far south. Maybe parts of the panhandle in Florida, and we'll get into that. Now let's take a look at this blue shaded area, where I do feel not only are you going to be seeing the coldest temperatures, but you're probably going to be setting up to see the most heaviest snowfall as far as the what you would normally see in a given year. I think the lake effect is going to be really high this year, really strong. But yeah, much of Minnesota, much of Wisconsin, into Michigan, much of all the Great Lakes, upstate New York, get into Chicago, into Cleveland, all those areas, into maybe northern parts of Vermont and New Hampshire, maybe northern parts of Maine, is going to be in those extreme parts, maybe some of those heavier snow events. But as we bleed a little bit further south, I still feel like you're going to get a lot of snow, but maybe not as high as still well above average in those regions, but maybe not as high and say in Iowa and to parts of Missouri here, into parts of Kansas, getting into Idaho, Indiana, and Ohio, much of the Mid-Atlantic, getting into DC, into Philly, into New York. I do feel is going to be a well above average snowfall year for you guys. And even further south, as we get into for some of the southern states, the southeastern states, I do feel it's going to be one of those years you're going to be getting some of those above average snowfall events, and much of Oklahoma, much of Texas, especially as you get into Dallas and say East Texas. I think even Houston sees some snowfalls this year, and even parts of Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama. Yes, I do feel even parts of the Florida Panhandle is going to be one of those exceptional years that you could be seeing above average snowfall. Now, again, these areas down south, if they see any snowfall at all, you don't really have to get that much snow. Your average snowfall is not really that much in these regions. I mean, we're talking one snow event out of the winter could put you above average. So yes, I do feel these regions are going to be getting snow. You're more susceptible to getting at least one or two possible Arctic outbreaks that make it all the way down to the deep south. So one or two of those events bringing Arctic air all the way down to the deep south will bring some of those above average snowfalls for those regions. So now let's take a look at the overall outlook for winter forecast. So in this green shaded areas, so yes, predominantly more or less in Washington and Oregon and parts of Northern California, I do feel it's overall going to be chilly and a wet and a little bit snowier at times winter for this region. As we go down further into California, yes, I do feel the drier conditions continue for those regions, unfortunately, and much of Utah going into Arizona. As we transition a little bit further off into the east in these pink shaded areas, yes, I do feel in places like Montana and getting into portions of Wyoming here, you're going to be seeing some of those polar plunge events over time but I do feel the coldest air is going to be a little bit further off into your east. So I do feel you're going to be getting some of those polar plunges at time, but not as many as the more or less places into the eastern parts. But as we go further off into the south in these pink, purple shaded areas, going into parts of, say, Albuquerque, maybe into Denver, going into West Texas here, I do feel these are going to be some of your bigger swings in temperature. We're going to be seeing those Arctic outbreaks at times, but then the south winds are going to be kicking in and seeing those massive spikes in temperature. So it's going to be pretty roller coaster for these regions up here. And to the yellow shaded regions, yeah, I do feel you're going to be more susceptible to seeing some of those Arctic outbreaks and much of the Dakotas, getting into North Platte here, all the way into Kansas. So I do feel you're going to be seeing some of that colder polar air for a good chunk of the winter months. And then let's go to the Great Lakes regions in this blue shaded area. I feel like the highest lake effect snow is going to be here off the Great Lakes. Some of the heavier, coldest temperatures, more susceptible over that polar air, those Arctic outbreaks, some of those extreme type events that we're possibly going to be seeing this year. Those areas are going to be hit hard this year with heavy snow in those regions and the coldest temperatures for much of the Great Lakes, and getting into our northern states, into Buffalo, into upstate New York. And yes, still very cold and snowy as we get further off into the south, into Iowa, getting into much of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, going into West Virginia, into northern parts of Kentucky. I feel like it's going to be a cold and snowy winter for you guys. As we get towards the I-95 corridor, getting in along the coastal regions, I do feel you're going to be more susceptible to seeing some of those blizzards this year. So yes, all this area I do feel is going to be a cold and snowy winter for much of the northeast states, and especially along the eastern seaboard. But as we go into more or less into Maine, you're still going to be seeing more of the snow, but maybe not as much as far as the anomalies go. But yes, further south, I do feel you're going to be seeing some of that southern snow and ice events setting up for much of that transition zone in the orange shaded zone here into much of Arkansas, get into Tennessee, much of the Carolinas, South Carolina, getting into Georgia here as well. I do feel you're going to be one of those years in places like Atlanta is going to be seeing some snow this year. you don't really see snow every year, but I do feel one of these years you're going to be getting some of that snow and ice events, especially as you go into Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama. Some of those anomaly years, yes, I do feel you're going to be getting that snow into Dallas, as far south into Houston, with those possible snow and ice setups, as you're going to be more susceptible to seeing some of those at least one or two pretty big Arctic outbreaks that I think is coming for this season, all the way down to the deep south. So I appreciate you guys watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Do like it and share it with your friends on social media. Be sure to leave your comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel to catch the latest update where I protect you before and after the storm.